Hello all, Rick here, looking into the lore of the Hermes Class, which is either 3 ships, or they are all separate. I'll just get into it. So, in Starfleet we occasionally see starships designed with a single nacelle, which is unusual. The dual nacelle design was more common because it allowed for an easier time in establishing a warp field. Other forms were possible, such as the warp ring, but a single nacelle is often seen as a tougher time of things than simply doubling up. Any more than 2 and it becomes superfluous unless you're creating a warp coasting design. See the Cheyenne class, for example. Compare riding a bicycle to a unicycle. Nevertheless, technically a single nacelle will do the job. Now, in the backgrounds of Star Trek, we have the images of the Hermes and Saladin class starships, while an on-screen vessel of the 23rd century was the USS Archer in Strange New Worlds' first episode. However, this ship was not mentioned by its class, so it received the moniker the Archer type, but it might indeed be the first on-screen appearance of the Hermes class. If so, however, then it's smaller than the Hermes class was envisioned too, although we can see the scale next to the Constitution class when it's docked at Starbase 1. Then again, even the Constitution class has recently had its size varied for behind-the-scenes scaling options, so things get a little unclear. As it stands, the Archer type looks to be only a couple of decks, in some shots then much larger next to a Connie. For this video, I'm going to assume that the Archer type is essentially a smaller version of the Hermes class that is built to the similar schematics just as the Constitution class had its Sombra class variant. And I'm not looking forward to trying to rationalise the Constitution class size discrepancies when it's time for that video. So, the Hermes class was originally designed for the Starfleet Technical Manual in 1975 by Franz Joseph. The Hermes class and the fellow starships contained in this book were to flesh out the Star Trek universe by expanding the fleet into ships not seen on screens, which continually reused the Constitution class in the instances where other vessels would have been cool, for probably budget reasons. The Hermes class clearly defied one of the initial design philosophies of spaceship design as stated by Gene Roddenberry, that the nacelles had to be in pairs. But I always found that to be a very limiting factor when it comes to making new iterations of starships. The various vessels in the technical manual were all to fit into different roles, and in the case of the Hermes, or in its initial introduction the Saladin class, was to be a destroyer and patrol vessel. The vessel would have remained non-canonical if it had not appeared in the background screens of the Enterprise on screen, which is a tenuous connection, but technically that counts. Enough to make a video on it, anyway. So, in universe, the Saladin and Hermes class were created concurrently with one another in the early 2240s, with the USS Hermes launching in 2242. They had many of the same internals, with only minor differences added later on, but as these differences were permanent, they received differing class designations. This is something that Starfleet would begin to work around by introducing more modularity into its designs. So the USS Hermes was launched from the San Francisco shipyards, utilising the designs of the Constitution class, but it lacked the secondary hull. This was because the vessel was not expected to operate away from Federation space on long-term missions, and as such required a smaller internal volume. Among other features, this shifted the warp core into the rear of the saucer section. The vessel had a cruising speed of warp 7, although it was less manoeuvrable than other vessels. However, it could reach warp 9 for very brief bursts of speed. That's the old warp scale. This means that it was capable of darting about, but that it was not the long-term deep space explorer that its contemporary Constitution class was, and more reserved for planetary surveys or studying selected regions instead of seeking the unknown beyond Federation borders. Therefore its mission profile was that of a scout ship. The Hermes and Saladin were both 242 metres long, 127 wide at the saucer, and 60 metres in height, with a crew complement of around 195 spread over 15 decks. It maintained a very minimal shuttle bay with 2 shuttlecraft and a shuttle pod, and was capable of atmospheric flight, although not landing. It had 2 sensor systems, one directly over the main deflector array below the saucer and one atop the bridge, taking up a large percentage of the saucer. This made it ideal at long-range detailed scanning, which made up for its lesser warp capabilities and saw it double up as a lookout on top of its scouting duties. The Hermes class had 3 phaser arrays, one under and 2 atop the hull. 1/3 of these vessels had heavier armaments added, and were the standard for the Saladin class, including the addition of 3 photon torpedo launchers at the fore and 6 heavy dual-mounted phaser cannons. A large cannon attachment could be further mounted under the saucer. The Saladin maintained the same warp capabilities as the Hermes, but lacked some of the finer sensor systems and operated more as a patrol vessel instead, responding to nearby threats with warp sprints. Its crew was 5 more than the Hermes at around 200, but aside from that it was identical. In the inverse of the Hermes class, when it was not patrolling or responding to threats, it was capable of light exploration and scouting duties, so did maintain laboratories and light science facilities. As for the Archer type, this appears to be a very small vessel with a minimum crew of only 3 personnel that was designed to dart out and survey a local planet or even make diplomatic overtures. The Archer, for example, was sent to examine the relatively nearby planet of Kylie 279 when a warp signature was detected, as a preliminary to first contact protocols. This diminutive vessel was not made for combat at all, although with it being so small its deflector array was more akin to the sub-hull variety as seen on a shuttlecraft. In place of the deflector was a single phaser turret, apparently its only armament. The Hermes class was a notable idea, with its variations, and we would see something similar in the Miranda class and the Echelon class from the 25th century, each having exploratory and combat cousins. However, the Hermes faded from use, with the role of that science scout being replaced by the Oberth, a smaller but scientifically capable vessel. The Saladin was more or less outclassed by other vessels, and as the Constitution classes became more frequent, it was outgunned and outscienced. As for the smaller Archer class, well, we don't see an immediate replacement, but all the roles that ship undertook could be fulfilled by 24th century Ravens or runabouts. Additionally, the Miranda outlived these for its adaptability. The Survey Miranda class did not have to remain as such, and could become a phaser boat easily enough. So, that covers the lore on the Hermes class and its derivations. Starfleet would occasionally revisit the single nacelle design in the future, but it is generally not the normal approach, as it requires a little more tinkering than the established design. Thanks for watching. I've been Rick, and I'll see you later for another. Until then, goodbye.